We are in Romans Part 4, Lesson 5. Today our discussion we moved into the next chapter. We moved into chapter 13. But again, as we always do, we want to kind of establish ourselves into where are we in our study of Romans. So let's do our little hand motions. The camera can't see all of you, but you're going to be doing them with me, right? Okay, Romans chapter 1 to 3:21. Sin. Very good. 3:21 through 5. Salvation. 6 through 8 is sanctification. Then 9 through 11. Sovereignty. And then 12 through 16. Service. Thank you. I only did that so that see if y'all were listening. Okay, so since we started this part in chapter 12, we're now in 13. What section are we on? The service, right? The service part of Romans. Now, there's other ways of looking at this book. That is just a really good way to keep in mind, especially using the alliteration with all S's. We also see a progression of thought. Paul is one that always kind of does that progression of thought, but it's starting with we each and others need to understand that they are a sinner, therefore there is a need for salvation. And once you get your salvation at your spiritual birth and you have everything, but we now are in the process in our life after salvation, in the process of sanctification. And during all of that and overarching all of that is the sovereignty of God. You know, He made us, He knew, He called us, He provided salvation, and then it's effective to a person once He calls them into that relationship and once they believe and accept. But He actually has to give us the faith to do that too. Everything is the overarching everything is the sovereignty of God. And then because of all of that, we have this within us that needs to now come out of us, and that is the service part, right? This is there was a doctrinal part of the book, which is all of that through chapter 11, and now we're in the practical part of the book, chapters 12 to 16, the what to do and how to do it. So the last few weeks, we have done our overview, and then we looked at chapter 12. We focused on chapter 12, 1 and 2, which was the part about becoming a living sacrifice that's holy and acceptable to God, and this is our reasonable service of worship, and that we're not to be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of our mind, that we might prove what is what is perfect. Sorry, we're going to prove out the will of God. I almost have it, which is good, acceptable, and perfect. And that is a process in a sense, but it's also an ongoing thing. You don't just renew your mind. It's an ongoing, always renewing. And how many of you, I know it's true of me, need review? Yeah. That's why we start with that, because it may not be true of you. You've heard me say this before, but I literally can, after doing the study and actually trying to be ready for this, can come in here and go, what did we study this week? You know, my mind just blanks for a second. And then as we look at it, I'm reminded. So after we looked at 1 and 2, we started looking at the next part, which was 3 through 8 primarily, which talked about spiritual gifts. We did a very short, small study of spiritual gifts. But what is true of spiritual gifts for the believer?
We get them at salvation.
We get them at salvation. Who gets them?
Every Christian.
Every Christian. Every believer. Right. So do you have one? Yes. Do you know what it is? Maybe not. Maybe not. Okay. That can come over time. But do you have it? Yes. That's the certainty is you have. Do you only have one? You can have more than one. Can you have them all? No. No one has them all. Therefore, there's not a particular gift that is the proof of your salvation. And there are groups out there that teach that. So that is not true. That's not true, because Paul addresses not everybody has all of them, and there's not one in particular that proves out your salvation. It's good to have those kind of boundaries. Then last week we looked at 9 through 21, which shifted a focus a bit into our, as a believer, what are our relationships like? How do we treat others? And then we had some categories of others. The first set was dealing with other believers. The next part was dealing with our enemies. And the reality is we have them. As believers, we have them. If you don't, then maybe you're not living it out in such a way that people will be, or maybe you're just in denial, and that's not a bad thing in this case. I mean, it kind of is, but I mean, we don't want to dwell on that. We don't want to focus on who is our enemy. And I don't go out and make enemies. Y'all don't go out and make enemies. But Jesus promised us, as we're living for him and as we're like him, the world's going to hate us. It's just obvious. It's just immediate. And hopefully you don't have a whole lot of that going on in your life. And then the last group was all men, everybody, how we relate to them. Okay, so remembering that chapter divisions are man-made, when Paul wrote this book, he did not put it in chapter 1, chapter 2, as in this case now, chapter 13. There is a continuation. Sometimes there's a good break, and we know there's been a shift, but there's a continuation in thought. And then one more thing. One of the ways that Paul almost always writes his epistles is he presents a question, and then he answers it. And then he presents a question. It's called the progression. It's that bringing about that progression of thought. So there's not always a question, but that's one of the ways. So he usually, or there will be those concluding statements, like he'll have a whole bunch of information and say, kind of in light of that, or taking all that in consideration, now, let's move. Okay. So in chapter 13, what's the subject we start with?
Submission to authorities.
Submission to authorities, right. Now, so is that so different than what we saw before? Because remember in 9 through 21 of chapter 12, we had how we're to relate to believers, how we're to relate to our enemies, how are we to relate to all men. Now in chapter 13, it's how are we to relate to governing authorities, right? And what place do they have in our life? So we're going to call this one Believers' Responsibility. And that's either an individual believer or all believers, whichever way you want to put it as far as where you put your apostrophe. What is our responsibility? In this case, we're going to look at 2 governing authorities. So we're going to have 3 categories. And the first thing is what Karen said, we're to be in subjection to them, right? Okay. This kind of doesn't feel good, right? This is, we don't, as Americans especially, we like to think of our independence, right? But our independence is really independence as a country from other countries. Because we could not function, no organization, no small or large like a country, can function without some structure to it, right? Okay? Would we want to live in a country, this one or any other, where there was no law? No. If you've ever, of course, we probably all grew up in Westerns, you know, the Western movies and stuff, like John Wayne or whatever, and they were very appealing in many ways. You know, the rough and tumble, got the man's man, and y'all, yet, have you ever seen the more raw movies or read a book that's a little more real about like what it was like in the Wild West, truly? How lawless it was. How a lot of times there was no number one, they might not even be a state yet. Might just be a territory. And if it was officially a territory, again, there had already started to be some rule there. But a lot of times there would be, like you could live in a town and there would be no marshal or sheriff or any kind of law there. What happens in a lawless society? Chaos. Yes, what else?
Evil.
Very much so. Unrestrained evil. Is there evil in a lawed society? Yeah. But hopefully there is a process and it's restrained. There is at least some cautions in people's hearts. Okay, so let's talk about where does the authority come from? If there's a governing authorities over us, governing and rulers over us, where ultimately does their authority come from? Right. So their authority, all authority ultimately, is from God. And it says it was from God, I should say from, and it says it's established by God. Does your mind want to argue that a little bit? Right? Because what we see or hear about doesn't feel like it fits that, right? Right. Okay. And especially in our, we want to look at our situation, which we need to do. But when you look at history, and especially like the nation of Israel, you see God's desire for Israel was that they didn't need a king. Why? They had God, Jesus being king, but they had, God the Father, they had that, and they were to be self-governed. If you look at what Thomas Jefferson wrote, I think, I'm trying to remember if it's in the Declaration of Independence or if it's in the preamble of the Constitution, somewhere. He talks about self-governed. Laws work when people abide by them. Right? You've heard me say, or you've heard it, I'm saying it because somebody else did, good fences make good neighbors. So it's a saying, right? It's just like one of those iconic things we can say. What does that mean? Well, if my property is up against Martha's property and we both agree this is where the property ends, mine ends and yours ends, or ours each start, then that fence is a nice visual, right? If I have cattle on my side, it keeps my cattle from going into your yard and stomping all over your flowers, right? Or if you have dogs on your side, it keeps your dogs from coming over and getting into my cow. Theoretically, right? Okay, so that good fence makes us good neighbors. And if we both agree on maintaining that fence, then we're not going to have many issues. Because that's why it says good fences make good neighbors. Okay? Some people believe all fences should be gone and open borders and all that stuff. Well, if we literally had that in the scenario I just said, Martha's dogs could take down my cattle and kill them, and my cattle could go in and destroy basically your yard, your property, or whatever, and you're going to have to step around cow piles. Be quite literal. And I don't want to come and poop scoop in your yard from my cattle. So that's the idea there. They're established, so the authority is from God. In other words, the idea of structure and authority is from God. And it's not just the idea, but the government that you have, and when I was using Israel for an example, that was God's desire. When He put them in the land, that they would not need to have a king. And they got Him, and that they could be self-governed. He had given them structure, He'd given them the law, and if they abide by it, followed it, everything would be okay. But over time, that's not ended up what happened. And over time, they stopped following the law, and they wouldn't listen to God, they wouldn't listen to anything, and God would bring in outside enemies that would overtake them. So what happens then? They're under the authority of ungodly people. And it was a judgment from God. And they'd cry out after a while, and he'd raise up a judge, as he called them, judges, and that judge would go and take care of the enemy, and there'd be a little peace for a while, and people would get comfortable, and they'd go right back into their path of sin. And then God would raise up an army to come and overtake them. So who's in charge? God. Right. When we look at our situation, because it's easier to look at somebody else's, but when we look at our situation, might we be having the problems we're having because God is trying to get us to stop our ungodly ways? Possibly, right? Okay, so as a person towards those governing authorities, we've already said we're to be in subjection, but it also tells us that what happens if we resist authority?
Receive condemnation.
Yes. If we resist the authority, we are opposing the ordinance of God. And we will receive condemnation. Consequences. Right? Now, those rulers themselves, the next verse is telling us, what are they not? They're not the cause of what?
Fear.
They're not the cause of fear. If we're doing good, right? They're not the cause of fear if we're doing good. That one's pretty easy to remember, right? If I'm not speeding, I will not get a speeding ticket. If I'm not breaking the rules of an organization, they won't kick me out. In theory. This is really basic, right? If I don't come and break into your house, I will not be hauled off to jail for breaking and entering. Right? If I walk up and ring the doorbell or knock on your door, I wait for you to open it and invite me in, then I'm not going to be arrested. So good behavior, no fear, no condemnation. But if you want to have no fear, this is another part of this. You just do good. If you want to have no fear from the authorities, do good. And probably will get praise from that governing authority. Still waiting on that letter, but in theory, right? Especially at a very small, more one-on-one level. Okay? Now, they also tell us in verse 4, these authorities are called what?
Minister of God.
Minister of God. Now, I found it interesting because when we say minister, we're usually talking about it in a very positive way. If you have a ministry, you're blessing someone. You're purposely helping someone out. That is a ministry. But this says they're ministers of God, and it shows a good side and it shows a bad side, right? They're ministers of God for good. But they're also ministers of God as a sword and an avenger. In both cases, it says they're a minister of God, which I find very interesting. So, if you want to have no fear, do good. But if you do evil, be afraid. This, as the avenger, whose wrath are they bringing? God's wrath. Right. So there's a purpose in that. God has appointed, or God has established the government, the rulers, as his minister. He calls them a sword And he also says they're an avenger that will perform his wrath. Wow.
So God really doesn't allow it, He purposes it.
Yes. In the way it should be. Okay? People can pervert this. But the way it should be and the purposes of God are that this would be the plan. So again, he doesn't, I mean, it is God's wrath because they have violated. Remember, if you resist, you're opposing the ordinance of God. It's a big thing, right? And you receive condemnation. You receive condemnation from that governing authority. You'll break the law, you'll get the consequences, you'll go to court, whatever that consequence will be. And if you're resisting, but if you're doing good, you shouldn't fear and will get praised. If you do evil, you should be afraid. This is all part of things that we can understand because we have a government and we have laws. We are a constitutional republic. We are a country that's not based on democracy. You've heard me say this, you probably know this, but it was really eye-opening to me. I would have said we're a democracy, but we are not a democracy. And the bad illustration of democracy that I can always use is mob rule. Again, take the out west. There was no law. A group of people caught you as or at least they accuse you of being a horse stealer. You stole horses or cattle or whatever else. They're going to hunt you down and they're going to string you up. Because there's no authority structure there. What if you're innocent? You know, that rope is going to kill you. And there was no court of law. So when there is that governing system, instead you would be taken in and you'd be tried. And God lays out in the Old Testament, there has to be at least 2 witnesses, et cetera, et cetera. And our court system is set up that way. But in that illustration I was given of the lynch mob, they have voted and decided you're guilty. And you hang. Or Paul faced a mob and had to be, a group that Paul was with faced a mob and they switched on a dime. Jesus, when he was before Pilate and all of that, they had laid out the palm fronds on Sunday. They had waved them. They had laid their coats down. They had said, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord" on Sunday. By Wednesday and Thursday, Thursday they were saying, "Crucify him, crucify him." The literal same people. Because they were stirred up. And the rulers of the time were going through the crowd and saying, "Crucify him, crucify him." Mob rule, that's democracy. We're not mob rule. We are a constitutional republic with a democratic system for how we elect. Thank the good Lord. That's what we are. Okay. So, we've already seen that we're to be in subjection, but it says it again in verse 5. To be in subjection, not only for what? Yes. Well, first, it is ultimate for the conscious sake, but we're to be in subjection because of wrath and for conscience sake, the sake of our conscience. Again, that would be the self-governed part. And it gets real practical at the end. It's of these verses, this set of verses. It says to pay taxes, right? But there's like 4 things it says to render to all that is due. The first one is taxes. The next is custom. What else?
Respect.
Yep. Fear or respect. and honor. It's good, I'm glad that you brought up the word respect, because that is a different translation, but it's the same idea of what we have towards God, is a reverential fear. And a lot of people don't want to look at the wrath of God and the true fear we should have of sinners in the hand of an angry God. But we should have that kind of fear of God. The one that Paul says, don't fear the one that can take your life, which is man. Fear the one that can both take your life and send your soul to not heaven. You know, I mean, that's who we need to have a fearfulness of, the kind of fear the way we talk about it. But it's also more of a respect. But if you, like as a child, if you are respecting your parents, part of it is because of the punishment that could come if you do wrong.
It's wisdom.
Yeah. Wisdom applied sometimes. Or something applied hoping to get them to wisdom. So it is fear, but it's also respect for authority. But even on the side of respect, there is a fear, because part of the respect comes from just knowing what the possibilities are, but also to honor. Interesting, we all know that a child is to respect and honor his parents, and then at a point when they become adults, they're supposed to continue to honor. But they don't have to obey. Actually, it's more obey and honor. And then at some point, they don't any longer have to obey like they did before, because they're on their own if they truly are. Okay, the next category we're going to look at is to his neighbor. And I found it interesting that she didn't take us, well, she did take us to the passage, she did take us to the passage that whenever we think of neighbor, if we're going to define neighbor, it's the passage about, Jesus told the story of the man that was beaten, and who comes along? The Samaritan, the Good Samaritan as we call it. There are 3 people that pass by. 2 of them are Jews, and 1 of them is a Samaritan. So just put it in context, the Samaritans and the Jews were enemies. The Jews saw them as half-breeds and not worthy, and they weren't supposed to come around them, and they were in their own little pocket and area, and so they would go way out of their way to walk around that area to get beyond it. What did Jesus do? Walked right through it, right? He went, because the woman at the well, remember, was in Samaria. And his followers kept going, why are we going this way? Why are we stopping here? You know, if nothing else, you just get through quickly. And Jesus decided to take a break, and, you know, just so happened this woman comes along. You know, I don't believe in coincidences. Okay. So in verses 8 to 10, the focus here in this chapter, and it's a continuation again of this thought, how are we to treat believers? How are we to treat our enemies? How are we to treat everyone? How are we to act as having authorities over us? How are we act towards those authorities? Recognizing them as from God. And now, how do we act towards our neighbor? Who is our neighbor? I'm sorry?
That says love one another.
Yes. First is, oh yes, love one another. It starts with oh nothing, says it better, but oh nothing but love. Again, these verses are man-made, but if you look at the prior, it's talking about taxes, custom, pay your taxes. And then it says, owe to no one anything. So this could include money, but it's mainly including anything, because it also talks about respect and honor. For every person out there, don't be in a deficit to them. Owe nothing except for love. Give love. That's what you should to love, and to love one another. And then it says, loving your neighbor is what? It fulfills fulfills the law. And then in verse 9, it quotes the Ten Commandments. You shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet. And if there's any other commandment, it's summed up in this as saying, you shall what?
Whereas yourself.
Love neighbor as yourself. And apart from people who are negative about themselves, and apart from people who maybe are suffering from depression at the moment or anything else, I'm not trying to dismiss that. I'm just saying we're not talking about an extreme view over there. How much do we love ourselves? Especially in America today, what is the main and overarching problem? Selfishness. We could say probably 40, 50 years ago, the number one cause for divorce was money. I don't know if you know that, but when they studied it and they looked at it, the money issues were whether it was they didn't have enough, they were constantly having to work, or whether it was one was frugal and one spent out the wazoo, you know, they just didn't mesh. Money was the number one problem and cause of divorce. I don't know how many years ago, but I'm gonna say like 30 or so years ago. Do you know what it is now? Number one? The opposite of what I just wrote up there. Selfishness. Self-centeredness. Self-focused. I don't know if it's in your Facebook news feed, but it's in mine all the time. Statements about narcissism. Narcissism is an extreme self-focus.
It's a lack of respect too,
Okay? Because it,
another in a marriage.
okay, usually, yes, yes. But again, where does that lack of respect come from? Selfishness.
It's all
Right.
about me.
What?
It's
All about me. Yes. I sometimes say they don't think beyond the end of their own nose. It's all about me. And it comes in different forms. It can come from someone who seems to be selfless. You know, I do everything. But if that person is constantly telling you what they do for you, they're not doing it selflessly. They're doing it to get. So everything somebody does, if it's always to get back, always to get your praise, always to get your attention, always to have you feeling guilty if you're not doing enough for them. Do you have it? Can I hear an amen out there? I've got people like this, and unfortunately, and I always caveat this way, apart from that person getting saved, and I really believe narcissism is a person is truly narcissistic. All of us can be narcissistic. We always have to remember that, because it's just, everybody can be selfish sometimes. Everybody can be feeling like, well, what about me? All right? So don't go home and go, oh my gosh, I'm not saved. I'm saying if that's not your constant in character, we can get there. We need to get away from there. But if you know that person, and I can sit here and I can put a list up here of a few, thank goodness it's only a handful, that are true narcissists, they don't change. And I say apart from salvation, because God can change anybody. But are they ever going to see their need? Because they're never wrong. But again, God can. God can. Apart from that, that person's never going to change. That's what I've learned, and that's what I've actually read some studies. But narcissism, this is the opposite of that. It doesn't say love your neighbor more than yourself. It says love your neighbor like you love yourself. If you notice, when Paul gives the commands to the husband and wife, he says that the husband is supposed to love his wife as he loves his own body. I mean, it gets really specific. And be willing to give himself up for her, just like Jesus gave himself up for the church. And not to beat up on anybody's husband. I don't want to hear a lot of amens right now. But as a woman, our number one need at our gut level, flesh level, is security. The number one need of a man is to be respected. Okay? And it's just whether we ever really acknowledge that or not, it's true. So when you listen to someone, if you listen to the two sides in a marriage, even if it's a good marriage, but if you listen to those two sides, a woman is calm and comfortable in her marriage while she feels secure. When that bucket is full, whether she acknowledges it or not, whether the guy knows he's doing everything right or not, it's because she feels secure. The man. If they feel respected, not undermined, not constantly you go and rearrange the dishwasher. You know, not, especially in front of others, correcting them while you do it, okay? You might quietly do things or instruct later and go, I just wanted to think about this, but the dad that's constantly undermined in front of the children, you know, that's not respect. So this gets really down to the nitty-gritty. If your husband loved you like Christ loved the church, loved you just like he loved his body, and would be willing to give his life up for you, which I've said this before, I don't doubt instinctually any man would literally take the bullet when it really came down to it, would step in front of you, would pull the attacker off, whatever. I honestly think almost any man would instinctually do that. But the question is, will they live their life? Not die for you, but will they live in a self-sacrificing way? If they did, and I hope you have this, then you're secure, right? There's no better security than knowing all of that. And it's not our place to go and say, you need to be doing this to me. Let the Holy Spirit do that. We're not to be their Holy Spirit. On the other end of it, does that man feel your respect? You need to say it and you need to show it all the time. And interestingly, I believe, somebody else said this and I just really believe it, all of the commands are quite contrary to our nature. Okay? So it's not in a woman's nature necessarily to constantly show respect to, what do we have to be? In subjection. They're one of our authorities, by the way. Ordained by God, by the way. Established by God, by the way. And we're to be in subjection to them. It never says on that list over there that the governing authorities are supposed to subjugate you any more than a husband is supposed to subjugate a wife. We are to submit. Because there's an order to that. God puts us side by side in creation, in the garden, as co-regents of the earth. Sin said, got to change things a little bit, and one has to be in authority over the other. He chose the man to be in authority over the woman. And when that authority is benevolent, when that authority loves you and treats you as much as he loves and treats himself, and if that authority would die for you and be that covering over you, you're comfortable, you're happy, nothing's a problem. But we are in subjection to them to be showing respect. So one of the governing authorities over here, where you need to put yourself in a very practical way, I need to put myself in a very practical way, is my husband is a governing authority over me. How are we doing on that? That is rhetorical, by the way. How are we doing on that? Keep thinking about that. Maybe go to him. I mean, definitely say the words, definitely show respect. Maybe go to him and say, do you feel respected by me? If you're having problems, it's probably, maybe, in that area. And he may not be able to verbalize it. He may not be able to, these are just truths. Okay, so our husband's also our neighbor, right? We're to love him that we're not exempt from that. This is what I also love about God's rules and God's laws and God's ways, is while he does these gender-specific and role-specific commands, husband, wife, female, male commands, he also pulls them back around and says, oh, by the way, you're supposed to honor and respect each other. We're also supposed to love each other just like we love ourselves. So we're not off the hook of loving our husband like we love ourselves, and we do. If you want to test it out, even a person who is suicidal, and I don't say this lightly, but a person who's suicidal, if you went to them and says, okay, and said to them, okay, I'm going to take this off, and you just put a pillow over their head, and you hold it down, trying to suffocate them, they will fight you. Okay, did you remember the part about they were suicidal? They will fight you if you try to kill them. We love ourselves a lot. We indulge ourselves a lot, which isn't true love, but that's how much we love ourselves, is we feed our flesh a lot. Look at our size. So then it says, love does no wrong to a neighbor. This is like a little bit of a different. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. And it also says again, therefore, it's a fulfillment of the law. So loving your neighbor includes doing no wrong to that neighbor. I think sometimes God puts things in there like it's kind of a no-brainer, it seems like. At the same time, it's like, I just think of teenagers when you're talking to them, and they'll go, but you didn't tell me I couldn't do this thing, right? You know, you told me I couldn't do all of this, or I was supposed to do all this, but you didn't tell me this one thing. You know, it's like, you know, I don't have to write out everything. You know, we've all had those conversations, right? Because we've all had teenagers. Well, if you have, or you know about teenagers, or you were a teenager, you may have been the person that said that to your mother. But doing no wrong is a little bit different than just loving. Because the word love, we have to really think about that word. And you know, we didn't look this up this week, but there's a bunch of different words in the Greek language for love. There's brotherly love. We saw that in the last chapter. We're showing brotherly love. That's phileo love, or Philadelphia. It comes from that. Agape love is God's type of love, right? He's the only one that perfectly shows us agape love. Agapeo is the verb. Agape is the noun. It's unconditional. It is best put, in my opinion, that he has your best interest at heart. Okay? So the only way I can express agape love is when the Holy Spirit is in me and I'm letting him do it, because he is agape. Because as a human, we're never going to do it right if I do it in my flesh. So apart from the Holy Spirit, a human being cannot express this kind of love. But with the Holy Spirit, we can express agape love. And it is, like I said, unconditional. But understand, just in verse 9, you shall not, you shall not, you shall not. What are those? What are those? Rules, laws, conditions? God says in the Old Testament over and over again, you know, what?
Commandments. Commandments.
He has those if-thens. Like, if you break my law, then this is going to happen. He shows us over here with governing authorities. You have no fear if you're doing the right thing. You should fear if you're doing evil, if you break a law. And I mean the rule of law in your land. You should have fear. So are there conditions? Yes. But just like a parent to a child, that child can break your rules. You don't stop loving them. But there's a consequence for that behavior. What we've gotten away from in our collective thinking in America, and I'm going to say just as much in our churches, is we begin to portray the idea of love means we let everybody get by with everything. And you're shouted down if you say anything differently than that. I've mentioned to you that I have a situation where I have to talk to somebody. Well, I've started that conversation. And I've poured love out over and over, words of love, because that's not a fun conversation to have. If I were loving myself only and not that person, I would never say a word. If I wanted that person to like me all the time, I wouldn't risk it. But instead, I started the conversation. It seemed to be, this is a beginning, it seemed to be received in that love. I don't know over time if that will remain, but that is my goal. The only reason is I've said this before, I don't come into your home to find things that I want to fault you for. But if you're overtly doing something that violates God's word while claiming to be a Christian, then I love you enough to say something. I do. Because what's the consequence? Number one, maybe this person is not saved and thinks they are. Am I going to go, I don't care. You're not saved. I don't care. Is that love? Do I care? Yeah. Yeah, I do. If that person is unsaved and in your, somebody you don't not care that they're doing something destructive, because all of the sins against God are not good for you. Do you understand that? God defines sin by He just loves getting us in trouble. Right? He just loves it. He doesn't want you to have a speck of fun in your life ever. Right? No, that is not it at all. Any more so, and a parent-child relationship is always a good way to think of it, any more so than your kids may say that, you just don't want me to have any fun, Or I've even been accused by extra family, you don't want your kids to ever do anything. Well, I did. I wanted my kids to enjoy life a lot, and I wanted them to enjoy all of it. We just didn't need to bring the crud in that could potentially lead them down a bad path or put stuff in their brains they didn't need to know and be a burden on their soul. We tried to keep those things out. So love isn't a feeling, although there should be feelings that are going to come from it. Love is wanting the best for someone. Okay? So sinful behavior, whether they're saved or not, is not good for them. Let's just take one. Promiscuity. Promiscuity is fun, feeds the flesh, feels good in the moment. But we could all sit here and give a huge list of the detriment to a person's life physically, for their soul, for their emotions. We could sit here and give a laundry list that pleasure in the moment doesn't negate the problems for the rest of their lives, potentially. Which is it? We need to warn them, don't we? Whether they're saved or unsaved. It might be a conversation that leads to their salvation. If they're saved, then they're not right with God during that time, and God's not okay with that. And God's not okay with them. And it might be showing they're truly not saved. It's part of the conversation. So love is wanting someone's best. And that best sometimes doesn't include liking you. It's tough. We're coming into the period in our country, as it turns out, between Thanksgiving and Christmas, where we gather the most. If you took all the other 11 months out of the year away, this is the time when we get together the most, right? Family comes in town, friends get together, our groups and organizations and churches have more and more, school systems have more and more, whatever in your life. There's more time of gathering than ever. Therefore, you're going to be with people that you might need to have a conversation with. Because you love them. Okay, so the last category is, what is our responsibility to the day? We're not talking about any given day. We're talking about the day. Okay? What day are we talking about? What's it usually called? The day of the Lord. Right? Okay, so this last section is a responsibility. You might not have seen it as such. Interesting. I thought it was interesting when it was putting this together. It says in verse 11, and this do, meaning the love part, this do, knowing the time that is already the hour for you to awaken from sleep. For now salvation is nearer to us than when we believed. What in the world does that sentence mean? What's it talking about? What hour is coming? What salvation is nearer than the salvation? Okay, let's just stop and say, when we believed, that's your personal moment of salvation. Okay? So we call that part salvation. So what salvation, for now salvation is near, what salvation is it talking about if it's not talking about that one?
When Jesus comes.
Yes. When all things are brought, are kind of culminated, right? When Jesus returns. That salvation is nearer. Can we say that now more so than Paul saying it then? Is it nearer now than it was then? Yeah. Every moment, every day brings the time closer. We just don't know when that is. But we know the reality of a timeline, right? And if events way over here, the closer, well, we've got Christmas coming up, right? How many days till Christmas, right? Okay. I actually had somebody mention earlier this week that that Thanksgiving was next week, and I started arguing. I was like, oh yeah, it is. Okay, so today being Thursday, next Thursday is what we set aside for Thanksgiving Day, right? So we could easily say 7 days from now. Okay, so tomorrow, would I be closer to Thanksgiving than I am today? Yes. Am I closer to Christmas? Yeah. Which sits terror in our hearts because we're not ready. But similarly, it's saying, in the light of love, in the light of all of this responsibility that we have to all of these different groups of people as a believer, it's saying, knowing this, and love overarching it all, there's an hour that you need to wake up for. Are we asleep? Pretty much. We can be. Life just happens and it gets our attention. But wake up, it's saying, for now salvation is nearer to you than when we believe. The night is almost gone. The day is at hand. Remember, in the Jewish way of looking at things, the day, 24-hour period, started at sundown. When God did creation, he said a day, a night and a day, a night and a day, and a night and a day. He's saying, night is almost over. The day is coming. What comes with the day? Over here. What comes with the day? The sun. The earth turns, but to us it looks like the sun is rising. What is Jesus called? The bright morning star. This is the reference he's talking about here. Jesus is coming. The day is at hand. Therefore, lay aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us behave properly as in the day, not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual promiscuity and sensuality, not in strife and jealousy. That's just one list. You can go through the New Testament. There's list after list after list of behaviors we shouldn't be involved in. And so these are some categories of behaviors we shouldn't be involved in. Then it says, but, in contrast, put on the Lord Jesus and make no provision for the flesh in regard to its lusts. Okay. So, it says, therefore. So we're saying we are to love, knowing it is already the hour for you to awaken. And salvation is nearer than it ever has been. And we're to lay aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Not in carousing, it just gives the list. Not in carousing, drunkenness, sexual promiscuity, sensuality, strife, jealousy. And in contrast, we're to put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision. Make no provision for the flesh. So I just wrote all that up there because we'd already read it. But wake up. Salvation is near. If right this very moment you could not get in touch with, like it's happening, you can see it coming. You know you've got 30 seconds before boom. Who just came to your mind that you need to talk to? Jesus, yes, but I'm talking about people who just came to mind that maybe causes your heart to seize for a minute because you really, really, really care for them. And they're going to, in that moment, you're wondering, are they saved? Or they say they're saved, but they're not living their life how they're supposed to live their life. And Paul says, I want to present you as a virgin, clean lamb without spot before Jesus. First we start with us. Am I that? Then we think about others. This is the part we don't want to do. This is the part we say, who am I to judge anyone? You're not judging anyone if God's word has judged them. You're just declaring what he says, and it is your place out of love for that person to want them to not face that moment. This moment that's coming. Wake up. This moment that's coming. You don't want that person to face that moment and either be ashamed before Jesus or their time is past. There's no hope after that. Hell is a reality. It's a reality. I don't want my worst enemy there. Therefore, we need to wake up. But in our own personal lives, lay aside the deeds of darkness. Why does it say deeds of darkness? Where do we generally do things that we don't want people to know about? In the dark, at night, at least when they can't see, whatever. Most crimes are going to be committed at night because the hope is they're not going to be seen, right? As opposed to that, put on the armor of light. Does this make you think of the full armor of God? Put on the armor of light. If we have the armor of God on, it's going to be shiny. So put that on, which includes the helmet of salvation, the breastplate of righteousness, the belt of truth, the feet shod with the preparation of the gospel. That's your full armor. Put it on every day, all the time. Put it on. Put on the Lord Jesus Christ. If you're putting on Christ, if what people looked at you and saw was Jesus and only Jesus, wow. Would you be taking them to the places that, or would you be putting on something that covered up and nobody really knew you were a Christian because I'm going to go do that thing? Don't carouse in drunkenness. Carousing and drunkenness are public. Things that you would be doing in a social setting. And again, we're coming into that social time of year. Sensuality and sexual promiscuity are moral problems. Strife and jealousy are about relationships. And sexual promiscuity and sensuality, and you may think of those as the same thing, but let me just explain to you a little bit of the difference, because I didn't really understand this at one time. We know what sexual promiscuity is, right? That's anything that has anything. Okay. The one thing that is not sexual promiscuity is if you're married and you're having sexual relationships with your spouse. That is the only time that sex is okay. Any form, by the way, of sex. Doesn't have to be, let's get real briefly specific, doesn't have to be intercourse. Any form of sharing physical with someone that is not your spouse, and that is a different gender spouse, husband and wife, no other combination is okay. That anything else sexual is sexual promiscuity. So that's a very broad term that covers a lot of things. Sensuality, what is that? We use that term a lot, or may use that term in certain ways that aren't completely wrong, but sensuality is anything that has to do with feeding your flesh's desires. So it can have to do with eating. Ouch. It can have to do with the music you listen to. It can have to do with anything. You know, like if you've got somebody that is way into spending money for clothes, let's say, if they're a clothes hound, if they can afford it and it's not hurting their budget, then and their spouse is okay with it, that's one thing. But if they're like breaking the bank and they're going into debt and they're getting that big car or that nice house or that whatever, and they're feeding their personal desires, that's sensuality. Anything that feeds your flesh, the senses, your senses. Just think of it that way. So it's a different thing than sensuality, and those are moral issues. And the strife and jealousy is your relationships with other people. So those are kind of the categories. So it's covering a broad category. But instead, put on the Lord Jesus. That's the idea of, would Jesus be doing this? You know, he's right there. He sees it, by the way. Even if it's in the dark, even if it's in your brain, you can't hide. You know, we've talked like in Romans 12:1 and 2, and we talked about a lot of things. One thing I hadn't brought up yet is when you look at what Jesus said, he didn't just look at the Old Testament and say, don't commit murder, don't commit adultery, like it says here, don't covet, you know, love your neighbor as yourself. He says if you look on a woman so as to lust after her, you've already committed adultery. It kind of raises the ante, doesn't it? Ups the bar. If you hate, and this is an abiding, constant, real hatred towards another human being, in this case, brother, literal genetic sibling, or person, other person, you've already committed murder. Okay? Jesus upped the ante. That's the difference in law and grace. When we're in grace, we're not above the law in the sense that we don't have to abide by it. We have a greater responsibility than just doing the letter of the law, which we should do too. So that's where grace is. That's where we're dwelling as believers. So make no provision for the flesh. I used the example last week, I think it was last week or a couple of weeks ago, of someone who said to me, I never intend for us to have sex. This was someone she was not married to while she was married to someone else. And I said, you have him living in your home and sleeping in your bed. Don't tell me you're not providing for it to happen. Don't give yourself that excuse. And don't think, and this was said by that person and said by this person recently, I can just ask for forgiveness and God's okay. I'm okay with God again. Is that how we're supposed to live?
Let it never be.
May it never be. Thank you. May it never be. Heaven forbid. Or, as I said to this person on the phone, by the mercies of God, just like Paul said in 12. by the mercies of God, listen to me. Change, stop. What you're doing isn't just, I'm upset with you, or God's upset with you. It's not for your good. And it's not what a Christian, somebody who claims to be a Christian, should act like. Make no provision for it. If I'm trying to lose weight, I can't have chocolate in my house. I can't have sugar chocolate in my house. I can have cocoa because I can use stevia. I can make chocolate things, just I can't have that stuff. Can you? If you're a diabetic or if you're an alcoholic, can you have the stuff around? Obviously, those are two different types of stuff. No. And it's really hard coming into this time of year because you go to every gathering and there's, I told y'all about talking to that cancer group that time, and I walk in and there's one counter with some crock pots with soup and a few salads, and you could get that. And then there was 2 6-foot tables full of dessert after dessert after dessert. And because I have to be gluten-free, that's kind of easy because there's probably nothing over there that I can have. Do I want it? Yeah, I'm a sugaraholic. You can now say, Peggy, hi, my name is Peggy. I'm a sugaraholic, and you can, and I'm saying that kind of lightly, but I'm serious. I love sugar. I love sweets. But I had to sit there and tell those people as nicely as I possibly could that everything I read about cancer, number one, get sugar out of your life. Everything I read, get sugar out of your life because sugar feeds it. Cancer cannot survive without that glucose in your system. It has to have it. Now, you're going to have some because we eat carbs and stuff too. But first, number one, get sugar out of your life. They didn't like that, by the way. And they liked it because they wanted to be comfortable. They wanted to feed their flesh. What do we talk about? Comfort food, right? How many comfort foods that just came to your mind are healthy? I actually have some now. And they really feel that same comfort level. And they're good for me. Right? It's tough. These are tough things. I'm just telling on myself. Okay. So make no provision for the flesh. We can think about it in terms of things like food. Just don't have it in your house. Don't take an alcoholic to a bar. Don't, as an alcoholic, think you can go and hang out in a bar with your buddies. If it were drugs, don't go there. Just don't go there. Don't go to the edge of that cliff and think you're not going to fall off. Don't go there. Don't make that provision. Find friends that will help you with that. But when it comes to all these other things, like it's pretty easy to see if somebody needs help in like weight management or whatever else and all, or other health issues. They may look perfectly fine, but you realize they have something like diabetes and they need your help. If you had a friend or family member, we probably all do, that is diabetic, you don't take them a pie, a sugared pie, right? Because you just love them. You don't. You find something else that they can have that's really, really good and take that to them. Okay, so this is kind of a continuation of thought from chapter 12, but in some very specific areas. Last week we were talking about the believer's responsibility towards those groups of people. This week we're talking about the believer's responsibility. That last week was in relationships. This has to do with relationships, but it's in categories of governing authorities, neighbor, which is everybody. Remember the Good Samaritan story isn't a fellow Jew was helping a fellow Jew. It was an enemy helping a fellow Jew, or seemingly enemy. They weren't personal enemies, but people group enemies. How do we handle people? So our neighbor in that case it wasn't that the Samaritan saw the Jew as his neighbor. What Jesus said is which one of those was the neighbor? It was the one who helped. So if we want to be that neighbor, we need to be the one that's doing what is needed for the other person in Jesus' eyes. And ultimately, and in all of this, as we love, what are we doing? Who are we serving? We're serving God. As we're in subjection to governing authorities, we're serving God. As we love our neighbor as ourselves and owe nothing to anyone but love, loving one another, we're serving God. As we're looking towards the day, we're serving God. I mean, this category right here, there's a verse somewhere that says, how now shall we live in light of the imminent coming of Jesus? If we lived our lives that moment by moment, every day could be the day. Do you want your account clean and short, you don't have much? Or do you want to have a whole bunch of things that you've got to confess to God? And Paul says, examine yourself in light of the faith to see if you're actually in it. Because if you can live in some of these ways, making provision for the flesh, if you can live and keep going and keep doing them, probably aren't a Christian. Probably not. And remember, it talks about for conscience sake. You know, it's all part of it. So, great lesson. We're going to stop here and take a break, and then we're going to come back and watch the video. Anybody have anything they needed to add or ask a question about? Sobering lesson. Good lesson, but it's sobering. Where are we on this list? Look at yourself personally and your relationship with God and others, but then think about, in your service to God, you may need to be talking to others. If you have any questions, I'll talk to you personally about it, because I'm having to look up scriptures and stuff. Good thing for me to do, and make sure that I use biblical terms and back them up. And pray for that situation, by the way, because it's not easy. I don't like being the person that has to say that. We'll end. Gracious and kind.